So, Tara, welcome. Thanks for being here with me. It's great to have you. So, I guess what we want to do is just kind of tap into some of your knowledge and expertise over the years. You've been a big part of the inclusion movement, and we just want to learn from you. And for people who've never heard of you, maybe if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hi, Elliot, and it's really great to be part of this opportunity. So my name's Tara Flood, and as you say, I'm an inclusionist. I'm a disability rights activist. I identify as a disabled person. I was for 14 years the director of the Alliance for Inclusive Education, that, as everyone will know, is a national disabled people's organisation that has campaigned for almost 30 years for inclusive education for initially disabled children and young people, but now they campaign for the right to be included for all disabled people in education, training, etc. So, but I left Alfie 2 years ago, and I'm now working for a local authority, I suppose doing similar stuff, but focusing more broadly on wider co-production with disabled residents and the local authority, where local disabled people are shaping policies and shaping service design and delivery. So it's kind of part of the same work. I'm just having a bit of break from work specifically on education.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So, your story is fascinating, and I know the story a little bit based on, we've worked together before, but there's people that don't know your story. So I thought it'd be quite an interesting place to start. If you tell us, you describe yourself as a special school survivor. Is that right?
I do. Yeah, and I always will be. So. God, well, I'll do my best to give you a kind of a short account. So yeah, I said before, I'm a disabled person, and I see it as a political identity, but I haven't always. And I think that original sense of identity was shaped very much by being forced to go to special school when I was still a baby. I went to residential special school when I was 16 months old. My parents were convinced by the education authorities back in the late 60s that it would be the best thing for someone like me, and that locally schools wouldn't be able to educate me, and that really I probably wasn't that educable anyway. And it was a tough, devastating experience, as it is for disabled people. Not only that it breaks a relationship with our families, and it, my relationship with my family never really recovered from it, but it also shapes your sense of self in a very, very negative way, because it reminds you and it instills in you that you need to be separated from society, because you are so different and you are so lacking in value that you need to be somewhere else. And education may be part of that experience, but the main experience is one of normalization. It's one that sees you as having deficits. I'm someone with a very obvious physical impairment, and the main focus at the residential special school, which I'm very sad to say still exists and is thriving in this current political climate. But the main focus of that residential segregated institution was to attach various additional limbs to me to make me appear normal. But I felt then, and it took me a long time to recover from that, I felt anything but normal. And my return to mainstream life was a very, very tough experience, because I'd never really engaged with non-disabled people of my own age. And so my return to life was tough, and it took me a very long time to work out how mainstream life worked. And I felt for many, many years, because I'd had a really terrible education in segregated school, as is the case with all of my peers, that it took me a long time to catch up. And I probably never have caught up educationally or indeed academically. But the real shift in my life was meeting disabled people who were politicised, who woke me up to the social model of disability. And thank God they did, because it was like a light switching on in my life, and the sense of liberation that came from understanding the social model and knowing that actually it's no longer my responsibility to turn myself inside out to try to fit in with mainstream life. It is actually the responsibility of society to make room for disabled people and to treat us as equal citizens with rights. And it was a relief to get to that place. And I'd say in some respects, the majority of my life started from that point. It really did. So that's probably a good point to pause.
Definitely. I would like to ask you how you define the social model of disability, because I know not everyone might have heard of that phrase.
Yeah. So the social model of disability was created by disabled people in response to, I guess, what I've just described. This institutionalization of disabled people, this devaluing of disabled people's lives. And it's really about no longer seeing disabled people as the problem, no longer seeing the problem lying within disabled people, but actually seeing disabled people as experiencing barriers to our inclusion and our equality, and seeing society as a series of attitudinal, physical, environmental barriers that need to be removed to empower disabled people to be part of society as equal citizens alongside non-disabled people. It's a response, and it's the absolute opposite to the medical model of disability that sees disabled people as the sole, as our impairments only, and that we need to be fixed, that we need to be normalised, but ultimately that we need to be removed from society because we are burdensome. Whereas the social model flips that on its head and is a rights-focused approach to disabled people, and it's about seeing us as human beings and as equal citizens.
Amazing.
Does that make sense?
That's really good, really clear. So it's kind of like, you don't need to change to please society. Society needs to change to accommodate you, basically, which is really, beautiful thing if it actually happens. So,
well, that's what we're all campaigning for.
yeah, that's it. That's why we're kind of doing this, really, to expose these ideas to people that might not have come across it before, and spread the word, really. So I know that we are at Inclusive Solutions. We all are really big advocates for inclusive education for everybody. But there's parents I've spoke to over the years, and they've said stuff about this to me. That this guy I know, he said, my son is autistic, and we took him out of mainstream school. We sent him to special school, and he's doing really well. He's thriving. Now he can talk and everything like that, and he's sort of really pleased with the progress he's making. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on that. What do you say to parents like that?
Yeah, what I say, I think what I say to parents is, I'm not blaming parents for the choices that they make, the decisions that they make. What I know is that the education system is absolutely set against finding ways to meet disabled children and young people's access requirements. And so, yeah, there are lots of examples of parents who take their children out of mainstream because mainstream is failing them. But mainstream, in many respects, is not an inclusive system yet. I think what Inclusive Solutions say and what inclusionists believe is that we have to work towards building an inclusive education system that meets the access requirements, the educational requirements and aspirations for all of the learners within that system. And then you create a system, an education system, where parents have confidence that their young person's access requirements, their educational requirements, their social requirements will be met within that system. So that's what I would say. But I would also say to parents that think about, whilst placing your young person in a segregated provision may feel like the right decision at this particular point, it's always important for parents to remember what life looks like beyond school and what life is going to look like beyond segregated provision, and talk to disabled people that have survived that system, and in many respects understand that the sense of segregation then becomes a lifelong experience that disabled people, whatever our impairments, whatever our labels, have to learn to live with and have to learn to, I suppose, try to overcome through understanding the social model, understanding disability as a social construct. And so this is absolutely not about blaming parents, but it's about understanding why parents feel they have to make the decisions that they have to make now, but recognizing that what we're talking about when we talk about an inclusive education system is something that values all learners, and that goes beyond being in school for the period of time that children are in school, and thinking about what an inclusive education system offers beyond school, the school system.
We were talking about this the other day, how important going to school, you don't go to school just to get your grades and to get your GCSEs. You go to school to be with your mates and to hang out with people your own age and kind of
to build friendships and to understand how the world works. I'm afraid we are just in a country that is utterly obsessed with grades and academic outcomes in a very, very narrow way. And there are so many other systems around the world. I was in Canada a couple of years ago and experienced an education system that was so fundamentally different from our own here that, yes, does see a place for academic outcomes, but as part of a broader education. It's not the sole reason that young people go to school. And I really feel constantly disheartened by the education system that we have in the UK, because it's so disappointing and it's so old-fashioned in many respects, and will not meet the needs of younger people as they leave school and move into the world of work, and because work is very different now compared to how it was when this academically only focused education system was created 100 years ago. We are not thinking to the future now when we continue to focus only on academic outcomes.
So when you was in Canada, what was it specifically that you saw and you noticed that was working really, really well?
They see the value in everybody's learning.
Yeah.
And they don't measure. This was in New Brunswick. This is not all of Canada, by the way. And Canada is a federal country, so each province has its own education system. And so in New Brunswick, and for almost 40 years now, they've had no special schools. They just decided in the mid-80s, with some visionary leaders like Gordon Porter and others, that they recognised that they would never achieve an inclusive education system whilst they still had a separate education system for certain children. And what was interesting, I think, about Canada is that their desire to be more inclusive was based on the tradition of segregating Indigenous children, Aboriginal children, however Indigenous communities want to be described. And it was just really fortunate that disabled children benefited from that, because they weren't caught up in a kind of a polemic discussion about inclusive education, mainstream education won't work for disabled children, because the focus primarily was on stopping the segregation of Indigenous children, if that makes sense. So in Canada, in New Brunswick, they shut special schools pretty much overnight. They made in 1988 segregated education illegal.
Wow.
Woohoo!
That's what we need.
It's absolutely what we need, because in many respects, how long are we going to wait and continue to segregate more and more disabled children, including children with labels of special educational needs, who in my view are all disabled children, because the process of labeling children as having special educational needs is in itself a disabling process, because it wants to identify deficits rather than recognizing the barriers that those children have to learning and to education. And so there is something incredibly arrogant about this country, that we refuse to learn from other countries. But that arrogance has always been there, of course, as a result of colonialism, etc. But we continue to just refuse to see where other countries actually might have an education system that is more relevant and more focused on 21st century thinking.
Yeah. Right, that's a good point. 21st century thinking. Inclusion now is very different to inclusion in the 80s, I'm guessing. We kind of come a long way in certain areas, but not all areas. So what, in your opinion, is the biggest challenges that we're currently facing at the moment in terms of the inclusion movement itself?
Well, I suppose it's how does the inclusion movement address the increasing levels of segregation, but also the way the system is almost pitting different parents against each other in terms of based on impairment labels of their children. So this real huge growth in the privatization of education for children with labels of autism and what I would describe as neurodiversity, which is how adults, politically aware adults with autism identify themselves. There has been a huge growth in that area. There has been a huge growth in the privatization of the education of kids with labels of challenging behavior. And this is just about, well, in some respects, it's about, a government, a political class that wants to just privatize education generally, but also a kind of a growth in pharma that wants to overly medicate children. And so that the massive growth in behavior-related labels that we've seen over the last, 10, 15, almost 20 years now, it's continuing to identify new groups of children for special education attention. But what that really means is just pushing them out of mainstream. And so the groups of children in mainstream are reducing because there is this huge drive out of mainstream and into a whole different new grouping of segregated education. And I think, how does the inclusive education movement address that? Well, we need to start calling it out. We need to start saying, well, but who then is mainstream for?
Yeah.
And we need to start challenging I suppose we need to start using Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities to call out that what this country is doing is tantamount to a human rights abuse against disabled children and young people. But also the fact that so many segregated education providers are now seeing a growth market in post-education institutionalization. I feel like we are going back to the time when I was a child, where it was pretty much the default position that disabled children were kind of siphoned off into segregated provision in education, but then ultimately into adult institutionalization. How is this being allowed to happen? Well, it's being allowed to happen because the government has used under the umbrella of austerity, an opportunity to cut funding to schools, and schools then see that as an opportunity to I guess, get rid of children that are most expensive. And guess what? That's children that need full-time support in school. And that's the children that parents then say, but mainstream isn't working. Well, yeah, of course. Mainstream isn't working because suddenly the support has disappeared. So there is a new and increased focus on academic outcomes. Ofsted has taken its eye completely off the ball when it comes to pastoral care and inclusive provision. And so I guess I often describe it as a perfect storm that is pushing away from inclusion. So I think the inclusion movement needs to be more unified in calling it out, and it needs to continue to identify, as I know it has always done, good practice where it exists and what stops that good practice developing beyond individual schools. It needs to call out where we are going against Article 24, and it needs to support parents to, I suppose, not allow support to be removed from their children. No, that's wrong. I'm not saying parents allow it to happen, but what can we do to support parents to challenge the loss of support and challenge the increasing pressure to remove their children from mainstream?
Yeah.
There's a lot that has to be done, Elliot, and I suppose the inclusion movement needs to, have a better sense of being unified in how it can work with new parents who are at the beginning of making these really difficult decisions for their young people. We need to be calling out educational psychologists who go along with what is easy rather than what is right. So anyway, I probably said quite a lot there.
I need to know more about this because one of our other videos we did was advice for educational psychologists. So this would be quite a good time for you to give us maybe a bit of advice for educational psychologists who want their work to be inclusive. What can they do?
Well, I'm not an ed psych, so but as someone who has survived a system that shouldn't exist now, educational psychologists just need to be braver. They need to be braver. They need to call out bad support. They need to call out bad decisions made by schools and local authorities. And they need to, I suppose, work more collectively with other ed psychs to say, what can we do together? How can we work together to address some of these challenges, but also to share good practice where they see it? I think I'm not sure that ed psychs talk together much anymore because the education system, because local authorities have, I suppose, destroyed the networks that used to exist. Because we have an education system now that is based on competition rather than collaboration.
Yeah, a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I'm afraid it is. It absolutely is. And the victims in all of this are the young people, learners, students and pupils who are forced out of mainstream into segregated settings, increasingly far away from home, who, when they reach the end of their education experience, return to their communities as an unknown person, both to their families, but also their communities. Yeah. And we are storing up trouble for the future in the same way as we did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We need to be getting on and learning the lessons from the past. which is why Alfie did that fantastic oral history project 4 or 5 years ago, How Was School? Because it captures disabled people's experiences from the last 100 years, and they are important histories for people working in education, for parents, but also younger people now need to listen to those stories. And so and to understand that we cannot go back to a system that the default position was to segregate out particular groups of children just because it was easier for the system.
Yeah.
It is a shameful place to be in.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to try and find is there a link to that online? Because I'll try and share the video. I'll put it in the description. So there's just one last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is like kind of a bit more of a positive spin, maybe a more hopeful ending. What is your advice for people who are interested in the inclusion movement and want to get involved with it? Maybe young people who can see the problems. What's your advice to them?
Okay, well, thanks for challenging my negativities. It's much appreciated, because it's really easy to sort of get into that frame of mind because everything feels so awful at the moment. Never mind the pandemic. Do you know what? Here's the thing. I joined the inclusive education movement because when I joined it, I didn't appreciate just how diverse and how exciting and how aspirational it is as a movement. Mm. The inclusive education movement is made up of people like me, special school survivors, disability rights activists, again, like me, but it's also made up of parents. It's made up of parents who have struggled to make great decisions for their children who are now adults. But it's also made up of new parents who are just on that journey. But it's also made up of incredible teachers, visionary educational psychologists. It's made up of amazing academics who are creating, I suppose, the thinking and the resources that parents and education professionals need to challenge bad practice and to challenge segregation. And it's one of the most, and it's quite right that it should be, but it's true. It's one of the most inclusive movements I've ever been part of, because it constantly describes what needs to change. And I think that's important for disabled people. It's important for parents, but it's important for teachers and for anyone working in education, because I think people come into education not wanting to do terrible things. They come in because they want to make a difference. Yeah. But I think they get drawn into a system that is incredibly bureaucratic, that is very focused on the medical model. And so it's very difficult to hold on to that new aspiration. But the inclusive education movement helps you hold on to that. Because it will constantly remind you about why inclusive education is important. Yeah.
And there's other people who believe what you believe. You're not on your own. I think this is something that keeps coming up.
Yeah. I think, was it Gandhi who said, even in a minority of one, the truth is still the truth? And I think the inclusive education movement provides, as you rightly say, and as I've said, people, it provides allies, and it provides strength, and it provides the vision that we all need to hold on to in what feels like a really, really difficult time. But it also provides an opportunity for you to get involved in the campaigning. This is a movement that absolutely values disabled people as leaders in that campaigning, and that everybody then becomes an ally to that campaign, because we are the people who are on the receiving end of the very worst of an education system. So it's absolutely right that disabled people are leading that campaign. And it is a movement that believes at its very heart in nothing about us without us. It is a fantastic movement. So I think anyone that is struggling or anyone that is new to this needs to get in touch with the Alliance for Inclusive Education, with Inclusive Solutions. There are lots of organisations and individuals who have been incredible leaders in this movement. So, yeah, I think my advice is get in touch, Google it, because it's a movement that anyone needs to be part of, that anyone that wants to make a difference and that sees what is possible for the future.
Well, thank you so much, Tara.
All right, Elliot. Listen, it was lovely to speak to you.